Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. Welcome to the National Book Critics Circle and National Writers Union conversation about addressing grievances. I'm Lauren LeBlanc. I'm here in my capacity as National Book Critics Circle Vice President of Events and your tech host for the afternoon. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details before I introduce our speakers. If you want to enable closed captioning and view a live transcript, click Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. You can click full transcript to view the transcript in the side panel of the meeting. Let's set aside time for questions and answers from our speakers, but if you have a question, we ask you to please use the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen at any time so that we can bring it into the conversation during the Q&A. Ask as many questions as you would like. I will be monitoring the questions and I'll also post relevant links throughout the session. Now I'd like to introduce our interviewer. Lily Mayer is a translator, a critic, and the author of the novels The End of Romance and Short War. She is the co-founder of the Freelance Solidarity Project's Culture Critics Working Group. And our panelists include Daisy Aliotto. She is the co-founder of Dirt Media. Her journalism and nonfiction have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Paris Review Daily, the New Republic, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. David Hill is a freelance writer and author living in New York. He is the chairperson of the National Writers United Service Organization and a former vice president of the National Writers Union. He serves on the board of the Sidney Hillman Foundation. His book, The Vapors, was a New York Times notable book and critics pick. He's currently writing a book about gambling for FSG. And now I'm going to turn this over to Lily. Thank you.
Oh, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you especially to David and Daisy for agreeing to take us through the NWU grievance process, which is one of the most valuable parts, I would say, about belonging to the National Writers Union. But let's start very nuts and bolts here. What is a grievance?
Well, I think a grievance, I would define a grievance as any dispute that comes up between a writer or some sort of media freelancer and the hiring party that they're doing this work for. Commonly, typically those disputes are around pay, either not being paid at all, not being paid the correct amount, or not being paid in a timely manner. But they really can run the gamut from, things that are kind of contract oriented to editorial disputes, et cetera. But and the grievances, grievance process that our union undertakes is to figure out how to help our members find some sort of resolution to those issues.
So can you tell us your individual roles, past and present, in the grievance process?
Sure. I mean, I was a member of this union for many years. The union helped me with a grievance that I had once where I wasn't paid by a magazine, and the working with the union helped me get paid. And from there, I kind of got trained and learned the union's strategies and their approach to how to handle grievances for members. And I started volunteering to help with grievances, and eventually kind of became responsible for them all by myself. And I asked my friend Daisy to help me at one point, and she and I kind of became a team, and the two of us started doing grievances for the union, kind of handling all of them essentially, right? I mean, we were a team of two.
Yeah, the union has an intake form on their website, which is like the first touch of how we hear about something. Sometimes somebody will email a member of the union directly or one of us directly, or it gets forwarded to us. Um, a grievance, what we understand as a grievance colloquially is different from like what can actually be formalized as a grievance. The grievance process really starts after it's submitted, and we do some initial groundwork to make sure that this is something that we can take on. I think most of us in our lives have a lot of grievances, which are like things that we don't like. I think there's a lot of things that happen to freelancers that they might not like that does not cross the bar of being a formal grievance with the union. However, obviously we can offer a lot of solidarity. there is like a who, what, where, when, why initial investigation that always happens when something comes in, which is basically like, is there a contract? Was there a contract in place for this work? Who was the hiring party? Um, is there a paper trail in email or somewhere else about the freelancer's attempt uh, to resolve this on their own? And that after that initial investigation, we will say, yes, we can take this on for you formally. And at that point, we basically become the point person and advocate for that freelancer throughout the process. But it does still require sort of like active buy-in on that person's part. So like they're, except in like an extreme circumstance, they're not going to be anonymous to the other party. Like it's not like we will take it on for you and you won't have to give input or confront these people ever again. But I actually think, as somebody who was also a freelancer for a long time and has gone through what David went through as well and understands how frustrating it is when rent is due and somebody owes you, it's actually really good to um, get practice being part of these hopefully productive confrontations. I think this idea that there's like a blacklist in the industry is um, a scare tactic that people use to make people feel like if you make a fuss about not being paid, you would never be able to work with that party again, or, you'll never work in this town again. I've seen both sides of it because now I hire a lot of freelancers. And that certainly is not the case in my experience. So, anyway, long story short, emailing us does not automatically initiate the formal grievance process. Um, there are certain things that we would get that we would be sympathetic to and wouldn't be able to necessarily take on. I'm happy to give some examples. Dave will probably have more, but like, for example, like if a piece is taking a long time to come out, we cannot make the magazine publish it faster. What we can do is suggest industry standards that we have helped develop that say like some portion of the fee should be paid when the article is filed and accepted. Because if this magazine is operating in good faith, they should be paying a kill fee anyway. And so whether that piece is published or not published, this is what's going to be owed. As time drags on, we would suggest more of that fee as multiple rounds of edits happen. And so just being able to make that distinction of like, yeah, we actually can't force a magazine to publish your piece, but we can be an advocate for um, a progressive payment system that takes into account the fact that like the work has primarily already been done.
Sorry, I just have to let my dog in.
No problem. Dave, do you have
We're
any other
good.
examples of stuff that's like we would be sympathetic to, but wouldn't necessarily rise to the level of a grievance?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly we field a lot of interesting issues and disputes that come up. And yeah, we do have to have some sort of process to determine what we can work with folks on, what we can't work with people on. I will say that when I first got involved in the union, there was sort of an idea around the union that a grievance was really only a contractual dispute, and that if there wasn't a contract or if your dispute wasn't spelled out in the terms of the contract, there was really nothing the union could do to help you because there was nothing you could do legally. We don't take that. The union today does not take that position. We believe that anything, even things outside of the scope of your contract, could potentially be a winnable grievance. The trick is in sort of putting our heads together and trying to figure out a plan to win it. And that plan often would involve some sort of, building some sort of campaign, some sort of series of escalating moves that we think we could take to try to bring some pressure on the publication to bring some justice to the member who has the grievance. So we don't say no outright to just, there's nothing we would just say, no, we can't do that. But often when we do get with the member, we put our heads together, we may find that we don't have a lot of arrows in the quiver, so to speak, because of like what Daisy said. Sometimes the member is unwilling to do some of the things that we suggest maybe are necessary to win. And they may say, you know what, I don't want to do that. And they sort of, walk away from it. That happens frequently. But I would say that there are, one of the things that we get a lot that we definitely don't work with is when somebody's not a freelancer, they're not an independent contractor, they're actually on a W-2 and are hired and are working for publication. We don't work with those folks because there's a whole different set of labor laws and rules and things that govern those of us that are on a W-2 versus those of us that are independent contractors. And so we often try to point those people towards a more traditional labor union or somewhere else, or a Department of Labor or something where they can sort of seek some help that way.
Yeah, we are definitely heavily biased towards like taking on everything that we can take on. And I didn't want to imply that this is like a default no process. Another example of things that like are frustrating about freelancing but are not necessarily labor issues would be like um I always pitch this editor and they don't take my pitches, but they take other pitches that I think are as good as mine. Is that frustrating? Extremely. Is that discrimination? Almost probably not. So we don't get a lot of those, but uh, a grievance in almost every case something could be done, but it's not like everything that we don't like about freelancing. If that was the case, Dave and I would be very busy because there's a lot not to like, especially these days. But just to go back to Dave's point about putting your heads together with the freelancer, every grievance is different, right? And so we talked about how you don't necessarily get to be anonymous in the process. If somebody came to us and they said, I haven't been paid for this piece, we would start asking questions. And if for some reason they had not followed up after they invoiced, the first step might be to say, well, why don't you follow up again? Um, that's not because that's the most that we can do, but it's the first steps typically involve trying to get the publisher to do the right thing voluntarily. We never go straight scorched earth, especially if it's like, you know, maybe the freelance is like a little shy, they didn't want to ask and be sort of annoying. And it's like, um, you know, ultimately like at the higher level of like our tactics, like being annoying is one of the arrows in the quiver. So
Yeah.
yeah, like there's really no version of it that's totally non-confrontational, but what's great about it is you have the union by your side and at your back. And as long as that like legwork was done and can be done together, like the process is really typically pretty successful. Um,
Before we get more into the process, I just want to take a brief step back to clarify who the players are or can be. So you two as grievance officers, neither of you is a lawyer, correct?
no, should have
I
been.
call I call myself a jailhouse lawyer. I feel like we've learned a lot about the law over the last 10 years or whatever doing this stuff, but we do work with lawyers frequently on grievances, and so we take on grievances at our level, and we try to bring these things to conclusion as much as we can without having to involve lawyers or going to court. But we do work with a number of law firms and we often do take grievances to court and then work with lawyers when we do that. But it's our preference not just because it costs the union money to do it, but also we don't control the timeline. When something goes into court, it just becomes something that could go on for literally years. And it's even though often these cases are very slam dunk type cases, it's just a very slow moving process where we lose a lot of our ability to negotiate and move things forward. So we try to settle things without going to court as often as we can.
Yeah,
I
I
would,
want to underline something that you just said, David, which is that the union would pay, not the freelancer, which brings me to a question that I think is central, perhaps for some of the NBCC members who might be watching or tuning in later. What if you think you have a grievance, but you aren't a National Writers Union member?
It's a good question. I would say that you should still get in touch with the union. And talk to us about what options you may have and whether or not there's something that we can do. Membership, and I don't know if folks know this or watch this, but any freelance media worker can join the National Writers Union. You don't really even need to be a writer. There are plenty of members of our union that don't even write, that do all types of work within media. But we are all freelancers, and anyone can join. You could join today if you wanted to join today. And belong to this union, we pay dues to this union so that collectively the union can do things like this with these resources that we have to represent riders in these types of cases when they need help. But I'd say even if you're not a member of the union, but you have a grievance and you don't know what to do about it, you should get in touch with us and see whether or not we can help.
Yeah. Also, dues are sliding scale. So I think membership is an important way to signal solidarity with the process. Um, a lot of people join after they've been helped and they feel like it's proven its worth. To me, its worth is self-evident. But we, like Dave said, we're not lawyers. I would compare it more to like when you go to mediation, so you don't have to go to court. Going to court is always expensive. The union is not like we use outside lawyers. The union doesn't have like a staff lawyer, so it's not like there's a retainer for unlimited court activity. And court cases take like a really long time. A lot of hiring parties have really good ways of wasting time, especially if they're bankrupt or insolvent or on the brink of being insolvent. So getting people to voluntarily do the right thing and for things not to have to go to court is a huge part of what Dave and I set out to do. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but sometimes you just have to be the squeaky wheel. Or people realize that, hey, there's a reputational risk to not paying writers. In depending on which state you're in, we can help people, guide people through the freelance isn't free uh, process, which is outside of the union, but it's a tool that people can use in the state of New York. That's, it's law. It's something that we helped make law, and it is a defined pathway for people who haven't been paid above a certain threshold. And I think that's amazing. So to me, like that stuff goes along with our like educational work as well, which is like, hey, we can help you, we can support you, but you can simultaneously start going through this claims process. Um, it's City of New York and is it now state? Was it signed?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we have it in the state.
Yeah. And we also like work on trying to advocate for similar legislation and lobby for similar legislation in other states. We did have one grievance. This is the first time we've been able to do this that I know of, hopefully not the last, but um, we were hearing from writers that were all owed money by the same party, and all of them were filing separate freelance and free claims. And we were able to get in touch with the people processing those claims to say, like, why can't we bundle these together? Like, we know there's a problem, you know there's a problem. This party, the same hiring party, screwed over all of these people. Like, at what point will the city of New York actually take this on so that each of these individuals doesn't have to go through small claims, you know, themselves. So, and that's actually what happened. It kind of took on a life of its own. And L'Official, the magazine, was sued by the city, and ultimately had to pay out. But there's also like, I think being open to the possibilities that like things could work better than they do, and that there's strength in numbers. And it was cool to work with the city. I think Brad Lander's office was involved maybe a little bit there too in advocating for that. And it kind of set a new precedent for how these things could be handled in and out of court.
That's amazing. That's a huge win. So let's stick with it with a common, let's imagine a common grievance, a one writer case of somebody not being paid.
Mm.
How would you take that writer through the grievance process?
Well, let's see. I just settled one last week. I mean, and it was a group grievance, kind of like the one that Daisy was describing. And we get a lot of these group grievances because often where there's smoke, there's fire. And if one person's not being paid, it probably means some larger problem at the publication that other people are probably experiencing. And that's often our first step when we talk to a member or a writer who has an issue. We say, do you think other people there have had similar issues? And do you know anybody, or maybe we can help reach out and see if we can find other people that work for that publication or that place to see if the same problem is happening in other places. Because if it is, like Daisy said, when we bring people together and create a group grievance, we have a lot more leverage and a lot more. So often that's one of the first steps, is trying to see how much we can organize other folks at that publication into this. And that frequently happens to be the case. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it's very specific and individual, this it's just happening to this individual. And in that case, we would just work with that one writer, or we can't find other writers who are having the same problem. And we collect as much information as we can about what the situation is, any kind of paper trail, any kind of communications between that writer and the publication that they have, text messages, emails, other people who maybe were a part of conversations. We try to build up as much evidence, to make our case as we can. And we tell folks all the time, like, look, even if you don't have a contract, which unfortunately frequently people come to us and they don't have contracts, we say that even a screenshot of a text message between you and somebody about what you're being asked to do and what you're going to be paid can hold up as a binding agreement. And plenty of courts have found this kind of thing as being binding. So we try to make sure we can collect everything that this person has on whatever their communications were with that party. And then we craft a demand letter. We craft a letter from the union that we send to whoever we think the appropriate person is, saying, we represent this person. They had this dispute. We'd like to talk to you about it. We think that we could probably come up with a solution, amicably, just through if we just get a chance to talk. But if we have to, we'll go to court, and we don't want to have to. And this letter often gets this result. People will contact the union and they'll say, let's talk about this. And we alluded to this before, but I think it's a key part of what I think makes this part of our union powerful, is that often the cost of going to court to dispute some of these kinds of things costs more than what the person is owed, right? I mean, a lot of times we have members who are owed, under $1,000, maybe, you know what I mean? Or a couple thousand. It's always sort of an amount that whatever the cost of going to court is going to be way more than what the person's owed. The union is willing to pay those costs if they have to. They're willing to pay more in those costs in order to win this fight, to make the publisher do what they're supposed to do, because that's the sort of big stick that I think we have as freelancers that we can wield, is that we have this organization that will pay more to take you to court and make you pay me my $800 than $800, right? That's kind of why this is powerful. So if we can convey that somehow to the publication, that we don't want to go this way, but we will if we have to. And also, I always in those letters include links to stories of cases that the union has won against big publications for lots and lots of money, to show them that we actually do have a track record of this. Then they'll call us and talk to us, because they would much rather figure out how to solve this and settle it without them having to also go and hire a lawyer and go and litigate this in court. And so I'd say the vast majority of these cases, we do get a chance to talk to the hiring party and start some sort of negotiation with them, just from sending that demand letter. That doesn't mean those negotiations always resolve in something that we are willing to take, but we do often get them to start talking to us, which is the first step towards winning these things.
Daisy, you alluded earlier to writers not being willing to take the steps you recommend. Was that a reference to writers not wanting to send the demand letter, or something that becomes before the demand letter?
Oh, I mean, I think most writers are willing to go along with what's required. It's just like setting the expectation that it's going to be obvious that it's referring to them, in their case. Like the demand letter will name the freelancer by name. And that this isn't necessarily the end of their interaction with the hiring party. The demand letter does come from Dave or I as a representative of the NWU. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't hear from the hiring party again to work things out. And, the hiring party will know that they've taken the step of contacting us.
And unfortunately, when this has to go to small claims court, which when it is an individual claim and not a group grievance where we can get a big dollar amount because a lot of people are owed money, but it's just an individual, then the venue for this sometimes is small claims court. And in those situations, the member or the writer does have to show up in court, and it can be a really time consuming and unfun process that some people are not willing to go through to get, say, $600, if it means a lot of time out of their life that they have to go and sit in a courtroom and wait to be called, et cetera, which unfortunately is the case for sometimes for some of these grievances that fall under small claims. we as a union will work with them and go with them and help them. Daisy and I are volunteers. We don't get paid for this. We volunteer to. This is some of the work that we do for the union as volunteers, but we will work with them on that process. But frequently, members are not interested in going to small claims court, and so we try to figure out, like I said, a different way to settle this where we don't have to put them through that.
Yeah, that seems like a reasonable decision for someone who understands that they can do more than $600 worth of work in the time that they would be spending in court. And yet it's extremely frustrating and disempowering to have to make that decision. Yeah.
Yeah, so we figure out ways that we can, you know, put public pressure on a publication. I mean, the grievance that I just settled last week, we um, reached out to the publisher who owed these writers money, and didn't hear back. And so after we didn't hear back for 2 weeks, which we said was kind of our deadline, we then sent a letter out that included all the members of the board of directors, all of the people we knew were funders of this publication, and we sort of widened the net of people that we were reaching out to, and we heard back from him immediately. So sometimes it's about adding the, broadening the spotlight on a publication to get them to do the right thing is the next step.
I've had individual success using that strategy in a case where I had what I would now call a grievance against a university publisher that was publishing a translation of mine, which leads me to ask, are there strategies like that that you recommend that writers add to their toolkits? Things that we can borrow from the grievance process to get paid or to resolve an issue before it escalates to being a grievance?
Well, I think the key thing about what we do is that we don't start there. And Daisy mentioned this before about when she said scorched earth, right? I think that the key way to think about these things is a series of escalating steps, right? You should never start with the most dramatic thing that you can think of to do. And by dramatic, I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, you shouldn't start with your biggest move, right? And so we always sort of walk our way there by always offering an olive branch at every step to say, hey, I want to talk to you and work this out, and sort of hinting at what else you might do if they don't, so the idea that you would expand and sort of take this situation up the ladder, so to speak, that you start with a conversation with the person that you have the grievance with and say, I don't want to do that. I'd like to settle this with you. I think we could work this out. And that way you're sort of telegraphing what your next move is, but you also are showing that you have a next move. And I think before you even get started on this, what we do as a union is we think through what are all the steps. Before we go to step 2, we should know what is step 5. What are we moving towards here, so that we kind of have a sense of where things rank in terms of escalation.
I think this relates somewhat to the myth of the blacklist that Daisy mentioned before, but I would love, Daisy, for you to talk a little bit more about how do you reassure writers who are afraid in this process of being blacklisted? How does that relate to the degree to which you offer an olive branch?
Yeah, well, I had one grievance recently of somebody who had uh written a short story for a literary publication, and it was taking a long time to edit. And they decided that they wanted to take it somewhere else. And they thought that it was an unpaid opportunity. They later said that it would have been paid, but in their logic, they were like, well, I'm not really being paid for this. Literary publications associated with institutions like colleges and universities are usually all volunteer anyway. And so they took it elsewhere. And the person who was supervising the literary publication within this university on a volunteer basis had a very bad reaction to this, kind of flipped the situation and said that they had wasted the editorial labor of their volunteer staff. Um, and then they dangled the possibility of contacting the publication the second publication that was going to run the story. So this grievance was really this person was really scared. I could tell that they were really scared that this was going to have an impact on their professional reputation. And I just got on the phone with them. And I think I usually try to get on the phone with people as soon as possible. And I was like, this isn't this isn't real. Like, this person can't hurt you. This is an empty threat. What they're saying is totally unacceptable. If they attempt this, it will be made known to them that it's completely unacceptable. And so the demand letter was not really about payment in this case. It was like, you will acknowledge that you will not take retaliatory uh, steps against this person. They didn't even have a contract in place. Like it was basically requiring the party to acknowledge like there was no contract in place, that they would not take any retaliatory measures, and that they would need to acknowledge that in writing. But I do think like as soon as I said to the freelancer, like from the perch of NWU, like that's that's not real. Like this person is not gonna do this. This person's like is not gonna like hurt your reputation. I think it helped to just hear somebody say that. So I'm not saying like that threat doesn't exist. But the idea of a blacklist is obviously a lot more powerful as a threat than a reality. So ultimately, I think we really scared the pants off the person who had made these threats to somebody who was pretty early in their career as a writer. And, I think we really scared them straight. And they wrote back immediately and said that they would not do that. They would not contact anyone, that, this writer is free to go, free to take their story elsewhere. And, they didn't want any trouble. So, yeah, I think that that's like the power of the union as well. Like sometimes when we all work in isolation as freelancers, and it's easy to get in your own head and really scared. And it helps to have somebody say like, hey, we're not going to let that happen. Like that's ridiculous. And really kind of like deflate the bogeyman in those instances. And if that person can send like a pretty stern letter on NWU like letterhead, like all the better.
That is a case of a horrible actor, and it is striking to me how many literary magazines are bad actors, but there are also very many literary magazines. For book critics, that's not quite the case. There are very few outlets that publish book criticism for an amount of money that could contribute meaningfully to a person's rent, a person's bills. And I think it can be very frightening for book critics and for many other kinds of freelancer to confront one of the very few publications that is able to pay them a living wage. Have you dealt with a grievance like that where a person simultaneously has a real issue with a publication and cannot afford to jeopardize their relationship with that publication?
Definitely. And I think that's a great point that you make, Lily, that there's sort of in some situations there may be a small number of places that writers can um, pitch certain types of work to, and that makes each one of those publications or each one of those sort of outlets uh, incredibly valuable and important. I think one of the things that we often don't realize as freelancers, and we tend to think about it in those terms, that sort of all the leverage is on the side of the hiring parties because we need them, and we forget that they need us, right? That these same places that are publishing book criticism need freelancers to write it, and in order to get freelancers to write book criticism for them and to get quality work, they need to also not have a reputation as being a place that is unkind to freelancers, is not a pleasant experience to write for them. So a lot of the same things that we fear, they fear as well. And we have to remember that, like, as long as we do a good job of organizing and talking to each other and working together, we can realize that leverage in the real world, that it's only through us sort of organizing and talking and sharing information that we can have that same kind of leverage, where a publication has to fear that they'll lose contact with the pool of people that do good work for them. So I just want to make that point, because I do think that, like, that fear that we feel is very real, and I think that they feel it too. And if they don't, we have the ability to make them feel it. But to your question about have we done grievances with members like that, definitely, and it's uncomfortable and it's hard. I think that often a member has to get to a point where they realize that, like, they owe me this, or this is important to me to see this resolved, and I'm willing to risk angering this publication to force them to do the right thing. And sometimes it just takes people longer to get to that than others. Daisy and I often don't hear from somebody until they've already made that decision up in their mind. It's kind of more often than not, by the time they call us, they've kind of already decided, I'm willing to go forward. I think what we don't know is how many people out there have grievances, but they don't even send us a message, or they don't even reach out to us because they're nervous about exactly what you're articulating.
Yeah, and if somebody's not paying you, like they're the one that jeopardized the relationship, like not you. And I think it's like important to remember that. Yeah. Also, like union organizing is hard. Like actually we're at like kind of a remove when people organize their workplace, like they might sit next to their boss. And there's like a lot of proximity there. And so I think like also recognizing that it's kind of supposed to be uncomfortable, but it's the type of uncomfortable that can lead to really important progress is like another thing that helps. And not going through it alone is a big, I think, emotional weight off of people who know that they're right. I think in my experience, I have seen publications get um, even the more reasonable ones who will respond immediately, you know, they'll start the accounting process and they're late, but they eventually make that payment. They can get a little snarky and a little snippy, and but I think a lot of it is a reflexive sense of shame of having messed up because in a contract, like it's pretty clear who's not following the contract and not paying within 30 days is not an option. So, you know, when you're the one that points it out, if they have a negative or unfriendly reaction, it's typically has to do with their own sense of, you know, projection of having done something poorly or imperfectly. And I think like all of us have that reflex in ourselves. I've you know, a few times I've tried to avoid it, accidentally dropped the ball on paying a freelancer, and you know, they remind you, hey, you didn't pay me, I thought I did, I marked it off as paid. And like, you know, you do have that like moment in yourself where you're like, you don't want to admit you messed up, so you're looking for some reason why it's their fault. Oh, they must not have invoiced me on time or something like that. And you have to have the rationality to like dispel that impulse. So having been on both sides of it, I don't take it personally when a publication that's wrong tries to imply that you're wrong for pointing that out because it's a reflexive human behavior and the letter of the law is what's in the contract and in the law.
All right, this is going to be my last question before we move into the Q&A. So if you have any other questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A chat. But Daisy, is there anything else that you've learned now that you are an editor as well that you've taken to the grievance process?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's helped me see that in a lot of instances, it's important not to attribute malice to things that are fundamentally incompetence. Um, and so I used to kind of like um I didn't take as much like pleasure in the early parts of the process where you're trying to be reasonable, but actually I actually think there's like the most weight on those first letters because you are writing it to somebody that you have to assume is more like yourself than not like yourself, which is not always the message that we get in labor organizing, but often like before you get to the boss you have to go through a series of editors. And so I think I'm better at like not assuming malice than I was when I was a freelancer for a really long time and just had like it really frays your nerves. Like you don't have the patience. You have to pay your rent. But having somebody who is not in as not desperate, but as precarious of a financial position advocating you for you can be helpful. Because like you know, they don't have to necessarily be the nice guy, but we start off kind of trying to be the nice guy. And it's easier for me to have like theory of mind about maybe this editor didn't pass the invoice along at time, like in the right time, and they're embarrassed about it. And that's why they're not responding. And this is going to jog them out of that sort of avoidance. It's easier for me to have that theory of mind now, but my values haven't changed. I'm just in a different position in that power dynamic. And so I definitely feel that like weight of responsibility.
Thank you for saying explicitly that your values haven't changed, which of course is true because you're giving your time to be on this panel and you're giving your time to all these grievances. But I do think it's important to remember that staffers and freelancers are on the same side. Media is very challenging for all of us. I am going to go now into the questions in the Q&A. I think we've answered a couple of them. but one of our attendees wants to know if you've resolved any disputes that involve an AI detector generating a false positive, and whether or not the answer to that is yes, I'd love to hear about other potentially unusual or one-off grievances that you've encountered or newer grievances like AI problems.
Mm. I haven't dealt with any AI grievances yet, actually, but the union does do like a lot of advocacy for freelancers not having their work scraped. Like will be what is it? Like an amicus brief, is that the word,
Mhm.
Dave, to some of these larger court cases
Hmm.
against like OpenAI. So like the union definitely has a position on intellectual property that's really important, but I haven't personally received a grievance about like an individual's intellectual property. Doesn't mean that's not coming. It's really hard to prove. False positive, in this instance, like, um, I think I'm trying to think like what that would mean, applied to.
Like to have an editor accuse you of having
Oh,
used
I
AI
see.
to write a
Yeah,
piece.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay, I understand. Thank you. Um, no, I have not seen that. I could imagine how that could go down. Like if that did happen to somebody, like we would just kind of go through the process like slightly forensically, like we always do, of like, okay, like Google Docs will show like when you opened a draft, when you edited it, you probably have notes, you probably have your recordings from the interviews. So, um, like it's easier to I think this is actually an instance where it is pretty easy to prove innocence, but like if somebody made that accusation against me as a freelancer, I would probably panic and I wouldn't be as sort of like regimented in thinking through how to address it as I would be like as a volunteer that's like walking somebody through that. um but yeah, I think like more so actually we do get grievances about people suspecting that like their idea might have been plagiarized by a publication. That's sort of like those can be tough because a lot of people have similar ideas at the same time. But again, it's sort of this like forensic process of inquiry of like, okay, which editor did you send it to? And does that editor like work in the section that this piece was published? And, how far do we want to take this? Do we actually need to get in touch with the publication, or is there some sort of like, is there a train of logic that we can find that would assume good faith on all sides? um that being said, ideas have been stolen, stories have been stolen, and like in those cases it's like there's a process of proving that out that works pretty like reliably as well.
Yeah, and I guess I'd say for one-off examples of weird or unusual grievances that we've done, we did one recently where a writer was sued by that they were being taken to court by the hiring party, the publication, um, for like a laptop and money that had been fronted to the writer that they were trying to claw back after they left. And so we ended up getting involved in a case where we were having to provide lawyers to defend a freelancer against being sued, which was a new one for us. We won that, which was cool. And I think maybe the most unusual one I ever worked on was a grievance where a member of the union wrote a book. Another member of the union reviewed that book, um, and it was published and edited by another person who was a member of the union. And the book review was not a good review, and the author of the book was unhappy and wanted the union to help the author get the publication to put some sort of correction or something in about the review. And it was a real mess, and it was not a fun one to work on because everybody involved were all members of this union, and yeah, we did our best to try to, but in that situation, it really felt like we were playing the role of mediator between
Mhm.
between folks, and certainly, peeps there, not everybody involved in that situation wanted to have their union mediate, this dispute. So it was pretty ridiculous situation that wasn't fun to be a part of.
Yeah,
That
that
did
was
happen.
my example as well.
As an author who's also a critic, I find that just profoundly embarrassing, even to hear about.
Well, I mean, I would not have brought that grievance. I think what it ended up coming down to was, what had there been a factual error in the review, or was there negative commentary like a matter of opinion, which is like, it's really not for the union to prove. And there's other instances I think which would be much more black and white, where if somebody like um, wanted to force a correction, typically that wouldn't go through a union, that would go through like the publication itself. But this particular case was not, it was very not black and white. So yeah, I don't know. We haven't seen another one like that. So
We
Right.
made a lot of progress. We were able to convince the publication to do a lot short of the correction, but it just wasn't enough.
yeah, I think they printed, I think what we, if I'm remembering correctly, what we sort of like brokered was that they would print a response from the person who
Right.
written the book. Yeah.
This is sort of to your point about media before and editors, that, that it is an interesting place to try to figure out solutions like this, because it is true that there are so many layers, and often the people that we deal with as freelancers, who sometimes are the people we negotiate our pay with, are also sort of frontline editors who maybe have no real power to make some of these decisions themselves. Sometimes they're union members as well. Maybe they're in a different union. And it's like this throughout media and throughout the arts, where it's a real question about power, and who has the power relationships, and what role is there for a union to play when you represent people who are kind of on different rungs of this ladder. It's not a challenge we have completely figured out, but it's also one that I think that the arts and entertainment unions have been struggling with for a long time.
Well, I think that's actually a great setup to the only question in the chat that we really haven't addressed. So maybe I'll ask this question and we can go out on this note, which is that one of our attendees is expressing a fear that the Freelance Isn't Free Act incentivizes publishers to not hire writers in New York or in cities or states that have comparable legislation. I know that that fear was a big part of the discourse around the PRO Act several years ago. It can often be a fear that people have with reference to legislation that benefits workers. So what's your
Yeah.
response to that?
I would say in this instance, no. I think it's already a matter of law that if you enter into a contract with somebody, you have to pay them. This just sort of created an easier channel for people um, to to go after that payment. So it's not really that like the law has changed. And if a publication really only wants to work with people who have a really hard time getting their fee, there's so many things that they could do to like offshore that work, or just have AI write everything. I think most publications, like at the end of the day, want to work with the most talented people and to pay them. And I think if somebody is actively going out of their way to not work in states where they're guaranteed to have to pay that person, like a lot of other stuff will have gone wrong, and that's probably not a publication that you want to work with.
Yeah, we've certainly not seen any drop off in people that live in New York being hired as freelancers in media. It may be that the person who asked this question might be thinking about the fight we had over AB5 in California, because that was a completely different type of law even, and there was a lot of chatter around, will the passage of AB5 lead places in California to work with freelancers outside of the state of California? But that's a whole different legal question. That's the question as to whether or not freelancers should be treated like employees versus independent contractors. And the freelance isn't free law does not speak to that at all. It's like Daisy said, it's really a law that just gives freelancers a bit more leverage and a bit more power in enforcing contracts that they've entered into with another party. People that break the freelance isn't free law in New York can be held liable for double damages. And I think that part of the statute has really gotten the attention of employers, that they will pay within 30 days rather than keeping people sort of on the hook for months and months and months and months for waiting for their payment. So yeah, we have not seen any evidence that it's caused anybody to lose any work in New York or in any of the other states.
All right, well, thank you so much. I think that's a really great note to end on, because you've both underscored two of the fundamental points of this conversation, which is that really the grievance process involves a huge assumption of good faith on everybody's part, from your parts as volunteer grievance negotiators to the part of a lot of the people who we work with at publications. And also, it's so important for us as freelancers, as media workers, to remember that we are not powerless. We do not have to suck up to publications all the time. They want us and need us as much as we want and need them in many cases. For me personally, being part of the National Writers Union has really helped me remember that and use that knowledge as a touchstone in my own negotiations, which luckily have never risen to the level of grievance yet, but that is just luck. So thank you. I feel very lucky that we got an hour of both of your time, and over to Lauren to wrap things up.
Everybody, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. We're so appreciative of Daisy and David for joining us today, and to Lily for organizing the interview and asking such terrific questions and guiding this conversation in such a positive way. I think we have a lot to kind of take heart in, and I think leaving on that note of recognizing our worth as writers and the good faith with which we work with others as well is really terrific. And I hope everyone takes that away. Please, I've left in the chat links and email addresses for further information. If you'd like to join the National Book Critics Circle or the National Writers Union, please, we strongly encourage you to do so. If you feel inclined to donate, also, we would love that. But to everyone who joined us today, have a terrific day and thank you so much. We look forward to having more events co-sponsored with the National Book Critics Circle and the National Writers Union. So thanks so much, everybody. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Bye. Thank you.